Ralph Newell, and today we have with us Sumun Pendakur, a noted DEI expert and strategist. Welcome, Sumi, right?
Thank you so much, Ralph. Glad to be here.
Good. Before we really jump into the meat of the discussion, I always like to find out a little bit about our guests outside of the academic world. And I almost feel like the first question I'm about to ask you is a charged question only from this standpoint. I just saw this meme or a reel. I'm sorry, it was a reel. And it was a white man talking to an Asian American woman, and kept asking her where she was from. And she kept trying to say, I'm from Berkeley. And he wasn't getting it, but you know where he was going. But so anyway, I thought that when I said to you, okay, where are you from? I'm not going there like he was.
Good prefacing. I like that. And thanks for mentioning that meme too. Well, it's really a joy to join you on the In the Margins podcast. I'm a big fan of diverse issues in higher education magazine, so glad to be part of the conversation. So let's see. Where am I from? Roots. My family is originally from India, from Karnataka in South India. And so I am the daughter of immigrants. I'm a second generation American, and grew up in Evanston, Illinois, right outside the city of Chicago, the first suburb to desegregate outside of Chicago. And so that's really largely shaped so much of my own experiences, right? Growing up in a heavily Black-white neighborhood, growing up with a lot more Black kids than most other folks do, and especially in terms of fellow Asian Americans. So, schools were basically 50-50 Black and white, and then a few extras like us sprinkled in between, right? And that experience of race and class and diversity and power, even if I didn't always have the words when I was little, has completely shaped, my entire life and this trajectory in this field of social justice education, racial equity work. Grew up totally in the Midwest, but I've moved all over after college, moved out to New York City, and I've done all kinds of things. I was a labor union organizer for a while, organizing actually here in Los Angeles with SEIU Local 1877. My neighborhoods were Compton, Watts, Inglewood, and South Central. We were working on organizing low-wage employees at LAX Airport. Lived in New York City, worked in places that I hated. Because all of us need those experiences, foundational, right? Wish I hadn't had them. And yet, how much do we learn, right? Lived that broke ass life in New York City, living in Queens, in the city. And then eventually pursued, I went to undergrad at Northwestern University, double majored in history and women's studies, was heavily involved as a student organizer. And then eventually went to Michigan, University of Michigan for my master's, had a phenomenal experience there, especially because of the foundation they provided in terms of research. And I was there, this will be apropos to our conversation. I was there during the height of the litigation against affirmative action in the 2001-2002 period. Right. So to be there at that time, watching the institution try to defend itself against these attacks, illustrative on every level, right? And then eventually, I had met my partner out in New York City. He's an actor. So I was finishing up my master's program. I said, what are we going to do? And he said, babe, let's do it. So we threw everything in a U-Haul truck and drove across the country to Los Angeles and ended up originally in West Hollywood, where we lived for 10 years. Thank you, rent control. And then 10 years now in Burbank. So we're 20 years in LA. We are true Angelinos at this point. I'm never moving home to the Midwest because I can't go back to thermal underwear. Can't do it. So that's where I'm at. And eventually, worked at a number of places. We can talk about that if you want. Got my doctorate from the University of Southern California. Have served in a variety of roles as a director for Asian American and Pacific Islander student affairs, as a chief diversity officer and dean for diversity, and as a chief learning officer at the USC Race and Equity Center. So all of these roles. And then now, of course, in the last almost 3 years, launched my own practice, Sumun Pendakur Consulting, which has been incredibly exciting and really abundant and joyful to be able to do the work with folks who want to do the work well, particularly in the time that we're in, right? In a time of like multiple and constant multi-pronged attacks. So that's a little bit of where I'm from. I'm an Indian American, they see Asian American, woman, wife, mommy. I have 2 kids, a 10-year-old and a 4-year-old, my 10-year-old son, my 4-year-old daughter. So we are busy and running as all, working families are. And that's me in a little nutshell.
Okay. 10-year-old and 4-year-old. I miss that age for my kids. And then again, I don't at all. So, I don't know, it's a double-edged sword there. But you're talking about your husband's an actor. So besides him, then who's your favorite actor?
Oh, that's right. Because it's true. I'm the president of the Sunil Malhotra fan club, obviously. My hubby's, that's his name, Sunil Malhotra. Who are my favorite actors and actresses? Okay, well, as an Indian American, number one, Amitabh Bachchan, the hero of Indian Bollywood cinema. I grew up on his movies. I will always love him. He held this whole trope, especially in the 80s, as the angry young man, sort of fighting the establishment. And he's a phenomenal actor, and just his speaking beautiful. So I'll say number one, and then of course a whole bunch of other Indian actors, Amir Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, many others. And then globally, well, I guess at least talking about here, I would say a couple of my faves. I'm a huge James Bond fan. So really? All of the actors who have played Bond, from Sean Connery and Roger Moore, onwards, through Pierce Brosnan, through, oh my gosh, who was the most recent one?
You shouldn't have said it, because I could have said it.
Right? I just blanked on it. But y'all know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And he was phenomenal.
So speaking of diversity then, so what, there was all that talk that Idris Elba might be the next Bond. What did you think of that?
Well, I mean, the Bond trope is constantly reinventing itself, right? And so who hold, as a Bondian, I'll say whoever holds the 007 number, no one's going to be Bond, right? They're going to be 007. So any actor who brings that level of charisma and charm and deadliness, right, to the role, can do a great job. So I think if Idris wanted it, he could do it with style and with flair.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, we'll stay in Hollywood then. What's your favorite reality show?
You know what's funny? We don't watch reality shows.
Oh, what? Oh, come on. Gotta watch.
We've never been into for the most part, never found a rhythm with unscripted shows, and so we are big union supporters and supporters of union writers, union actors. And of course, right now we're actively supporting the Writers Guild strike. So, we've had sort of conundrums with some of the reality TV lack of care and regulations around some of that. So
I get
for
that.
all the reasons, but I mean, I'm not putting down anybody who loves to watch those shows, because I mean, those have been a constant fixture in the media landscape now for, close to 25 years at this point.
Exactly.
So do you have any faves?
Reality? Gosh, I probably would say 90 Day Fiance, only because that's the one I'm currently watching. But yeah, I'll watch them. Don't get me wrong. They're interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Great way to turn your brain off, and then also watch
absolutely
surreal, bizarre behaviors, right? Where you're like, am I watching a Nat Geo special? Because these people aren't even people. They're just wild.
Well, to your point earlier, and I get the sentiment that you were talking about with, the writers, et cetera. Some of this stuff is getting so crazy on reality TV. I'm almost feel like it's scripted,
Right, right. I think and it's true. There is a tremendous amount of background scripting that's occurring, even though they're calling it unscripted. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. All right. Last question. What is your guilty pleasure that you wouldn't want people to know, I guess?
Well, if it's that guilty, I'm definitely not telling you, Ralph. Let me figure it out. Okay, let's see.
Okay, well, PG version.
That's right. I'm a huge fan of very silly dance parties. I love to dance. I love hip hop, especially 90s hip hop. So, I will get my kids up and we'll turn on some good hip hop, and you will see me wilding out. Number one. Number two, I am also a huge romance novel addict. So I have been a massive consumer of romance novels probably since I was in middle school. And I have a very specific niche. It is early 1800s England.
Really?
You know
Okay.
how everyone recently was all talking about Bridgerton? And it beautifully produced, gorgeously done, but kind of that universe, that sort of era of storytelling is really interesting to me. But I've read probably, I don't know, 5,000 to 7,000 books set in that time period alone.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So for folks who are like,
Wow.
oh, wow, Bridgerton, I'm like, y'all, Bridgerton's amazing. And the
Wow.
writer of that, incredible, right? Julia Quinn,
Mhm.
whole universe. So anybody wants to talk about that, hit me up.
Cool, cool, interesting. All right, well, thank you for that. That's good. In regards to hip hop, I'm with you on that. So if you have Sirius Radio, they have, I can't think of the station number, but they have the top 500 hip hop countdown of all time. I listen to it all the time. Never straight through, obviously, but
Right.
if you listen to that one, it'll definitely take you back. You'll get nostalgic over some of the music. But hey, let's get to the meat of this. I was at the I don't even know where I'm at right now. NATAHE conference back in April, and I attended your workshop, and it was really good. And for me, a lot of it, I guess I'll say I had an epiphany, if you will, during it. You guys were talking about Asian Americans being, and I said, quote unquote, the model minority. So honestly, to me, as an African American in the room, I was like, okay, model minority. I've been hearing that for years. I've been with Diverse for 30 years, and I think I've never really taken it to heart to what that really means. And when I heard it there, almost like I heard it for the first time, it made me feel like, gosh, if they are the model minority, what does that make the rest of us? What's the antithesis of that? So either way, somebody has put us all in a box, good or bad. So tell us why that label is not a good label for Asian Americans.
Right. Great question, Ralph. And, we're coming right off of recording this today on, June 2nd. I know the episode will release later, but, we're coming off of the 31 days of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, right? In the month of May. And so a lot of opportunities for reflection over the course of that month. And I'm so glad that you came to our session at the NATAHE conference. For those of you who are not familiar, NATAHE is the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. So it's the National Chief Diversity Officers Association. Right. Phenomenal organization headed up by President Paulette Granberry Russell. And I served on their board of directors for a number of years. And it's a dynamic organization that's constantly moving and shifting. And particularly right now, right, their voice and their thrust is, even more necessary. But, you asked this great question about that label, particularly model minority. Why is it so pernicious and harmful for us and then everyone around us, right? So I'll offer two things. Number one, well, okay, Ralph, we're getting to know each other. I'm gonna probably offer like 6 things, but okay, let's roll with it.
All right, I'm ready.
We didn't name ourselves model minority. That didn't come from us by us, right? The term Asian American did in 1968, 1969 in the Third World Study Strike at San Francisco State University in the struggle for ethnic studies, which was led by students, community activists and organizers and others. That term Asian American originated to describe us, for us, by us. Now, I'm not saying that's a perfect term. I'm not saying it doesn't have its own problematics, but it came from us. Model minority didn't, right? And so that question that you asked, if we're the model, who isn't, and what are the implications of that? That's precisely why it was designed. So the first time you really even see these terms used is 1966. 2 major publications, the U.S. News and World Report and Newsweek magazine, U.S. News and World Report and the Wall Street Journal, both publish articles, one describing the model Chinese American population, one describing the model Japanese American population. Look how hardworking they are, how they don't rock the boat, how they're pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. What's happening in the mid-1960s, right? Why would you need to cultivate a face of a community that is also minoritized, that is also subject to racism, discrimination, exclusion, right? Every single racist immigration act passed in this country has been passed against Asians. So we are not immune from violence, racism, interpersonal discrimination, right? But why would you need to cultivate and construct a community that is a model in the face of large-scale resistance, activism, and organizing by Black people, specifically Black people, right?
Right.
So that it's designed primarily as a wedge tool is so overt, right? And so we want to name that, right? We want to name that the model minority naming is designed to create division, is defined as part of a divide and conquer strategy, right? Which is like the number one tool of capitalists and colonizers is divide and conquer, right?
Exactly.
So we have that. So there's one huge reason in its racist framing and in its fundamental anti-Blackness that the naming is problematic. And the second reason is that the model minority masks all of the complexity we have. We have over 65 different ethnicities in this huge Asian American category, right? And every single time you break apart the data and you take aggregate data, let's say Asian American income, Asian American education, Asian American health access, Asian American housing, whatever it is, and you look at it, you think, oh, wow, Asian Americans are doing great. They're doing just fine. If you look at the data in the aggregate, which is smushed together, right? You pull it apart, you pull that apart, and you see what the model minority, what kind of harm it creates for us, which is the invisibility and erasure of structural harm, violence, poverty, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to education, especially for communities that have experienced US military intervention, that have experienced refugee status and refugee trauma, that have experienced bombing and violence, the effects of US imperialism. And that is both for Asian American communities like Vietnamese, Hmong, Lao people, as well as for Pacific Islander communities, right? Whose islands have been the sites of military testing and bombing for decades upon decades, right? Putting military bases there, et cetera. So you pull the data apart and you see that model minority frame sets up an invisibility about how complex our community is, how resilient they are in the face of multi-generational trauma, right? Mm-hmm. And so then we miss the opportunities, right? Whether people are educators, whether people work in the corporate setting, they miss the opportunity to actually serve Asian American students or faculty and staff in any kind of nuanced way. So I'd say just for those two primary reasons, it's usage as an anti-minoritized, anti-Black naming, and the way that it erases our own struggle, pain, resilience, and power. For those two reasons, I'd say, I'm not down with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And like I said, it was eye-opening for me. Like I said, sort of epiphany. And I started reading up on it more than I ever had before. And you said in the mid 60s, they coined the phrase, I guess, in the media, but the practice goes back even further, maybe not using the model minority term, but after World War II, Japanese Americans were told they need to be more like the Chinese Americans, be more white moving forward. So, and to your point, discrimination laws, when you look at it, all communities of color have faced the same thing in regards to redlining, gentrification, living in underserved neighborhoods, the whole 9 yards, but it doesn't seem to, hit the mainstream media when you talk about Asian Americans. So with that label, model minority, what are some of the negative effects that it has on, you would say, on Asian American students in higher ed?
Excellent question. And I'll just double back to one point that you brought up, this piece about redlining, gentrification, exclusion. I just want to double tap on that for a second, Ralph, because people think about in different towns, oh, there's Koreatown, there's Chinatown, there's Japantown. And a lot of times people who don't know the history will be like, oh, wow, that's so cool, ethnic enclaves. It's not because people wanted to live like that. It's because they were not allowed to live in white neighborhoods, right? And I'm talking from the 1800s onwards. They were not allowed to marry white women. They were not allowed to become citizens. They were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to vote. Their existence was conditional, right? At best. right? And so just really naming that and being explicit about it. So I just wanted to double tap on that. But you asked this great question about how does that model minority myth sort of mask the experiences of Asian American students. And I should mention, for those who are interested, there's such good work out there, but if you don't have this book, I would highly suggest it. It's called Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Higher Education, Research and Perspectives on Identity, Leadership, and Success. It's a really groundbreaking book when it came out. It came out in 2012. But if you can imagine, Ralph, there's almost no books like this out there, which is stunning, right? There are increasing number of research articles. Sam Musaeus, for example, Rob Teranishi, Oyan Poon, Julie Park. These are some of the folks who are the leaders in putting out research on Asian American students and communities. But very few books, which is, again, the invisibility piece. For Asian American students, though, we have all these data sets. Asian American students actually experience the highest levels of bullying across the country compared to any other racial group. Asian American students have some of the highest rates, if not the highest rates, of suicidality compared to any other racial group, right? So we're talking K-12 and collegiate. We have sort of the general invisibility and erasure factors. And then I'll give you a really targeted example, right? In collegiate higher ed settings, I've spoken to so many students who said, I didn't want to raise my hand and ask a question because they expected me to know the answer.
Exactly. And when you're talking about the suicide rates, that's where my mind went to. Are some Asian American students just feeling this pressure, and if they're not succeeding, then life's not worth living. I know that's not real, but to some people that is real,
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of strings of that, right? It's externalized pressure, it's internalized pressure, all that pressure, we all come from communities that use pressure cookers.
Right.
Something explodes at some point. So either we transform ourselves or the system breaks us, right? Systems and structures around us, whether those are family-based pressures or structural pressures. So, this piece about, interestingly, every community, every minoritized community deals with a set of stereotypes, right?
Yes.
Some of those are even more violent and pernicious, but this one where I've heard from people repeatedly, oh, well, at least the model minority stereotype's a good one. My point is there's no good stereotype because it creates a narrowing of possibility. So what we would consider this set of stereotypes is an over-validation trope, right? That over-validation leads to, oh, well, all Asians are good at X. All Asians are hard workers. All Asians want to work late on Friday night when you give them your leftover work, right? Whatever it is. Again, you said this earlier, everybody gets put in a box. Trying to shatter those boxes, right?
You guys brought up some, like you said, some interesting points. One of the ones you talked about was the amount of Asian American, I guess maybe some people would say I couldn't say that, but the amount of Asian undocumented students that are out there and their plight. I think, the poster child of that is always, the Latinx students, but tell us about the amount of undocumented Asian students.
Phenomenal question, Ralph. And I'll mention one other point, which is, when we're thinking about Asian American students, K-12, but particularly in the collegiate setting, that one pernicious aspect of the model minority framing is that Asian American students are problem-free. They're high achieving, they're doing well. And so then you see that show up particularly in counseling, like the counseling and psychological services centers and offices, where there isn't culturally relevant or culturally sensitive counseling. There aren't Asian or Asian American counselors who understand Asian American students. Again, on every level, every part of the organization you can look at, you can see how that framing shows up as a lack of resources, erasure, and invisibility. Okay, so to this question about Asian undocumented, I'll let folks know if you're interested in following this thread. A wonderful colleague of mine, her name is Rika Venturanza. She's just about to finish her PhD, and her research is on Asian undocumented students and their families. And I just was the Asian Pacific Islander Knowledge Community of NASPA just did a whole research symposium like a week and a half ago, and I was serving as a discussant. And her research is so powerful and nearly brought me to tears because it's about the psychological damage that we inflict as a country on undocumented people every single day and the people who aren't undocumented, but their family members are undocumented, from the constant uncertainty and the threat of violence and deportation and exclusion, right?
Mhm.
Like, that's one of those things, right? When we think about power and privilege, like I'm a US citizen, I was born here. And that's still conditional, because depending on like what brown nation the US is invading at any given point, I have been screamed at in the street, go back to your country, whatever that country they think I'm from, right?
Exactly. No, you bring up a very good point. I was thinking about that today or other day in regards to, thinking about a conversation we were going to have and looking at Asian hate. It's like, I'm not saying Asian hate wasn't a thing, because it always has been, but I'm talking, it really got to the front burner during COVID, obviously. And well, we'll get to that. I don't want to interrupt your thought, but I did want you to talk about that too, how that's affected students on campus as well.
Absolutely. So when we think about undocumented communities, you're right. The face ends up being the Latina community, 100%. And that does them a disservice too, right? Again, every one of these framings does somebody a disservice. The fastest growing undocumented community is Asian. Increasing market share, as they like to say, of the undocumented community is Asian, right? And that is of all Asian ethnicities, Indian, Chinese, Korean, etc. So fastest growing, taking up increasing proportion of the undocumented community, not perceived as undocumented, right? So walking some really interesting lines there too around what's the potential. There's such deep pain, and then also the potential privilege of not being perceived as undocumented, right?
Right.
And then when you try to, let's say, maybe join the undocumented student organization, are you fully included, right? So then layers and layers and layers of conundrum there, if we're thinking about the collegiate environment, for example. And then we want, I think any of us who work in higher education or in related spaces, what we're always looking for is nuance, right? We're looking for, how do you meet the needs of XYZ given communities with all of their intersections? And how are we thinking about, the undocumented, food insecure Asian student who was not targeted in the campus's, sort of flyer campaign to advertise their new, food pantry or one-stop shop on campus, right? Yeah.
And this is just totally anecdotal. I visited a lot of campuses around the country. And I think the first thing that stood out to me visiting campuses on the West Coast was how many support centers they had for Asian students that I did not see as much out here on the East Coast, if you will. And I've seen centers on the East Coast for Asian students, but what got me, I shouldn't say got me, impressed me, that I saw in a lot of schools on the West Coast was it wasn't an Asian center. They had a Chinese center, a Japanese student center, a Pacific Islander center. How important is that for schools to have it that way?
Great question. This is a fine line to walk, right? Because there's no institution that isn't juggling, sort of a set of resources, right? Financial resources, human resources, and space resources, right? I don't know if I'd love to hear which campus had individualized centers for Chinese or Japanese American students, because I know of many centers that have, for example, targeted programs within the Asian American and Pacific Islander Center that sort of like, hold more space for like Pacific Islander students or South Asian students within. But
yes, and I could be overstating it to your point of an entire center. But what I saw, and the one that's sticking out to me the most is at Portland State University. And that was about maybe 10 years ago when I was there. So within a building, there were different rooms, if you will. So it may not have been like an entire center, but they definitely were breaking it down in racial, by what's the right word? Let me say ethnicity.
Yeah. Well, I think having some kinds of targeted spaces are obviously critically important. I came up through cultural centers, right? I was the assistant director and director for Asian American and Pacific Islander Student Affairs at the University of Southern California for almost 8 years. So that is, that's still where so much of my heart is. And, it's really where passion and purpose met so much for me. And so having these kinds of dedicated resources that are not just, the shell of a center, but well-staffed, well-resourced with budget, that do really critical engagement work around leadership development, community-based racial identity development, allyship work, right? Transformative work with the local communities, all of that is so powerful out of these kinds of cultural centers, right? Or identity-based centers. To your secondary question of, do we need a center for Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, like separate centers? I would say no, right? That's just me though. I think better resourcing the entities that help, for example, folks in an Asian American and Pacific Islander Resource Center actually do their work effectively, right? To have the fiscal resources, space resources, and staffing resources to do that work well, to build coalitions and bridges, to dig down for people to be able to drill into their roots and to build healthy branches. Because what I would ask, for example, you gave a Portland State, right? The question I would ask is, how are they helping students to build those really deep roots and also to build the healthy branches across Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, and also across other minoritized and marginalized communities, right? The LGBTQ plus community, the Black community, the Latinx community, the disabled community, et cetera, right? And those have to be fostered interactions. Like, we know the research from the last 25 years, it can't just be numeric diversity. It has to be, right? Interactional diversity, which has to be facilitated by people, right? Not by AI and not just by throwing out space, but actually has to be built.
I'm laughing. You got me kind of thinking, you think about the intersectionality of people. I'm like, gosh, somebody may need to go like 4 or 5 different centers on campus just to get help,
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So it's interesting. I'm here literally today in New Orleans. I'm at the NCORE conference, and my first time coming to NCORE was actually, ironically, 30 years ago to the day. And they were meeting in New Orleans and coming on the heels of, Bakke and all of the Reagan anti-affirmative action stuff. And so that was going on. And you fast forward to what you were just talking about at the turn of the century there, the Michigan case, the Texas case. And now here we are today, still talking about the same thing, just a different way, but the same cases, the same fights. So, we're all awaiting to hear what's going to happen with the students for fair admission versus Harvard case. I keep hearing people say, okay, this is a fight. This anti-Asian bias has been sort of co-opted politically now to maybe let this be, I think I heard it used as a Trojan horse to end race-conscious admissions for the benefit of white students. So what do you think about that? Do you think that's accurate?
Great question. Right. Well, because they've had a number of failed white plaintiffs, right? And we can think of who was the young white woman at the UT Austin cases, the center.
Rutner. Was it Rutner? Or something? I can't think of the name, but yes, I know what you're talking about. Yes.
Remember who I'm talking about. And she was so unsatisfied with the decision that she took it up to the Supreme Court again twice, right? So, and what's fascinating about that, of course, is that if you look at her case, her scores, her GPA were less than
exactly
the other people around her. And so, was it Abigail Fletcher? Abigail something, I feel like. So let me not misname, but people can Google who was at the center of those, the UT Austin cases. And so Students for Fair Admissions, folks like Ward Connerly out here who advanced Prop 209, right? And I want to be clear, Ward Connerly is a Black man. The man who heads up Students for Fair Admissions, I believe, is of Latinx descent. And so we need to be really clear here about agents of white supremacy who wear the cloaks and the skin color of people like us, right? And we know the saying, right? Not all skin folk are kinfolk, 100%. And we know that there is money and power to be secured if you are willing to be the devil's handmaiden. In this case, I mean, willing to be the operator of the right wing. And I'm being very blunt about that, I know, but there really is, right? And we can look at everybody from Dinesh D'Souza to Clarence Thomas and everybody in between and say, this is how we see how power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, right? So that's number one. Number two, the deliberate usage of Asian and Asian American plaintiffs in the SFFA, UNC and Harvard cases is 100% intentional. 100% intentional, right? Because again, what did I say right at the top? We were talking about divide and conquer.
Exactly.
It directly lends to the cause of having increased rift between communities. I think it's really important to know that the SFFA plaintiffs, these Asian American ones, have not allowed their names to be released. So we don't even know who they are. We don't know their backgrounds. We just know there's 5 or 6 of them. However, the students who are against, the Asian American students who have been so vocal and against the SFFA cases, you haven't seen their stories as much. They are vocal and loud at UNC and Harvard. They have run petitions, marches, rallies. They have generated local news media. They are loud and vocal, and they are much stronger and much greater in numbers than these 5 or 6, few chosen Asian American plaintiffs to make the SFFA case, right? And again, we need to go to the question of which stories do we allow to shape our understanding of this particular moment in history, right? Because there's plenty of people, especially Asian American students, protesting this anti-affirmative action, which is really, again, it's not anti-affirmative action. It's anti-racial justice. It's anti-remediation. It's anti-equity. It's any attempt to deliver on the promise of education, which is about transforming families, transforming lives, moving people into the middle class up and out, right? And that's also why these cases aren't necessarily taking place, these high profile cases, they're not taking place at your local tier 4 college.
Right, exactly.
Because these folks know that one of the reasons people are trying to get into Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford and Northwestern, et cetera, is because those are the engines of social capital, the drivers of social capital, those networks, those connections, right? And they're trying to hoard that. And so, and the whole discussion, Ralph, it just explodes, right? The minute we start looking at legacies.
Yes.
And legacy doesn't say white on top of it, except that it's a seemingly race-neutral policy that has a fully racialized impact. Because if your parents were the ones who went to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, et cetera, in the 80s, what's the likelihood that your family's white?
Right.
If your family was a donor in the 70s and 80s and 90s, what's the likelihood that your family is white? We have the data to back this up, of course, right? But again, you don't need a racialized policy when you have something like legacies. And you look at some of these institutions, they have 30 to 40% of their students are legacies. That is affirmative action for white people.
It really is, but it's never been framed that way.
Oh, no. And that is because the right wing is really good.
They're good.
Controlling the discursive narrative.
Really
good, right?
Yeah.
And of course, remember, this isn't coming out of nowhere. You and I both know this. This is now a nearly 40-year project that they've had in the works.
Right.
And to have this crushing affirmative action decision that will come down from the Supreme Court this summer, paired with the legislative attacks on over 20 different states across this country, right? Paired with the quote unquote grassroots movement of, moms for liberty and concerned parents who are fully astroturfed, right? They're very well funded to get books banned, to get curriculum changed, to have school plays be shut down. It is mobilized and mechanized and planned out. And so all you have to do is you go to the Manhattan Institute and you look at their model legislation, and then you see what's happening across the country. It's very deliberate, right?
Very deliberate. Very deliberate. Yeah, we actually had a workshop yesterday here. So I'm glad you kind of brought that up, talking about that exactly. So I want to pose some of the questions to you that I posed to the group in our focus group that we had. Because this legislation that you said, like you said, it's 20. I think there's right now, if my count is right, there were 25 that had legislation, I guess, at the top of the year. So 5 of them, like either it hasn't passed. Oh, no, not that it didn't pass. It failed internally, but it's coming back. They just had some procedural things. But there are 20 that still have current or have passed. So, and when you look at the landscape, that's half the country, right?
There is.
And, the demographics that are here at NCORE, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, as if we use their language, we'll say they're coming for your jobs, right? Because in this case, they're coming for these folks' jobs that are here at the conference. So one of the things I was asking them was, what are your concerns with this? So I'm asking you this as an educator. What do you think in regards to your colleagues out there? Especially, I'm glad you mentioned your time that you spent on the board at NATAHE. So it's definitely applicable. But what do you fear for your colleagues out there that are in these states?
I'd say it's sort of two levels of harm, right? When I think about the fears, there's
or concerns.
The fears, concerns, anxieties.
Exactly.
One is the macro, right? Which is this white lash, this backlash is, to me, I'll use my language, is so fundamentally evil. It's so corrupt, right? And I think about the young people in states across the country who will not get to read the books I got to read, right? When my teachers gave me at Evanston Township High School, the mid 1990s, early 1990s, gave me Toni Morrison and, right, gave me Sula, gave me all kinds of books, right? They won't be able to read that. They won't be able to, just today I read that in Texas schools that they won't be able to interact with legislators anymore. So they're telling them that they can't enact their First Amendment rights to, learn how to lobby and advocate.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that one. Okay.
Right. So, this sort of complete abrogation and destruction of the attempts to remediate 400 years of evil in this country, right? That's all this is trying to set the clock way back to genocide, back to enslavement, right? Back to putting queer folks in cages. It's all an interlinked plan. And so I do feel a great amount of anxiety and fear because of how weaponized and well-funded the right-wing effort is, and how weak so many of the supposed centrist and Democrat politicians are.
Right.
In not just the states, but across the nation, right, at the highest levels. So I feel a lot of, I think underlying all of that anger and anxiety is also just really deep sadness, Ralph, that this next generation of students is being treated as a battleground. And students have always been at some levels of battleground, whether we're talking about, Menendez, whether we're talking about Brown v. Board, right? Student, their ability to be whole people and to be participants in their future has always been a battleground. But this is probably the most vicious that I've seen it in the last 50 years, right? And I've seen a lot of battles. So there's that larger overarching picture. And then underlying that is my sadness for and anxiety for my colleagues all across the country. The ones who literally will have their jobs shut down, their operations shuttered, their budgets, halved or quartered, right? Or three-quartered, right? Whatever it is, who will lose the ability to do the righteous work that they're trying to engage in. And that's not me seeing that every single social justice practitioner, DEI educator across the country does everything right all the time. That would be silly for me to say that, right?
Right, of course.
But to essentially take a chainsaw to any efforts to help young people be 21st century thinkers, to be 21st century people who can work with other people, understand other people, who can fight the largest injustice, which is climate injustice, right? If that's taken away from the hands of educators, we're left with very little. And then there's this, the deepest harm, which is, so many of us already deal with racial battle fatigue or some kind of identity battle fatigue as it is. And to be trying to do the righteous work in states like that, I just think constantly about the toll that it's taking on people. And I want to be clear that the vast majority of DEI practitioners around the country happen to be people of color. Yeah. So we are putting a most immoral toll upon already minoritized and marginalized peoples. And we do it over and over and over again, right? And then we say, get up and keep going. And, stuff breaks.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the worst you've seen like in the last 50 years. I'll give a plug out to Dr. Eddie Escalade. I don't know if you listen to his podcast on History is Us. he talks about that. You go from the Civil War to the Jim Crow, all these different eras, and they seem to be, to your point, these 40, 50-year gaps where something radical has to happen, then change happens. And then, I guess we get comfortable, or the other side is uncomfortable. And then we have the whole thing again. So we are definitely in one of those right now. So we talk about your colleagues out there in the field. One of the things we've been talking about is diverse and wanting to report and get out there, and trying to find out from, people with boots on the ground is who should the allies be? And what I heard a lot yesterday, a lot of people were, definitely, people in the community, parents, et cetera, but one that kept coming up was corporations. And I know you've done some work with corporates. Do you see them as an ally? And if so, how can they be an ally?
What a great question. So yes, obviously on its face, yes, corporations should be allied. I think though that we're actually asking corporations the wrong question, because at the end of the day, corporations are responsible to their shareholders, not responsible to a moral imperative or to a mission in the same way our higher education institutions are. There is no almost no higher education institutions across the country that doesn't have something along the lines of, cultivating thoughtful leaders for tomorrow, or blah, 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 something like that in its mission, right? And, being embedded in community and doing, research that advances the human endeavor. That's not the corporate framework. And so if we are going to ask corporations to ally with us, then we have to be very specific about our asks and make sure we're targeting the corporations that have deep DEI portfolios and that have also very deep wells of legal teams, right? Because one of the things that is at play on the corporate side, of course, and you may be following the story, is the passing of the law that allows for individual shareholder litigation. So if I'm a shareholder and I own one piece of stock in a company, I can bring a lawsuit against that company because I don't like their DEI work. And I think that it harms white people or it makes white people feel guilty or whatever the rationale is, right? So the companies that are lawyered up will be able to fend off this potential onslaught. But what's happening is that there's a whole rung of companies that know this is on the horizon, who are rapidly pulling back on any of their DEI promises or DEI work, especially the ones who made relatively recent promises, like in the last 3 years alone. To be like in any situation in which we are searching for and asking for allies, we have to be cautious about who we choose to be our allies to see if they're actually going to show up. Because the worst is to show up somewhere and we think, oh, they're going to be here and they're going to be here, and you're there by yourself.
Right.
This is also a time, even though we are tired, even though we are hurting, this is a time to bring our most strategic visions to the fore about who are our partners, and also how do we continue to push in increasingly creative ways to move around. If the right wing says this, how do we go over, on top, under, behind, inside? If this is what's on the surface, right? So that's sort of I do quite a bit of work with corporations at this point, and I really enjoy working with the ones who are advancing an internal equity and inclusion and belonging mission. And I've witnessed some really good work in that sector. And I'm also watching, as we all are, the rollback, right? That in this wave of layoffs, oftentimes the first teams to get laid off are the DEI teams.
Yeah. No, that's true.
So it's I'd say, again, like everything, complex, right? We got to be sticky about our thinking.
Yeah. You're talking about, make sure they look at the legal side of this. And I was in some of the readings recently, if you want to say that was a problem, but that has been sort of maybe the sticking point with some of this stuff early on, that not only institutions, but corporations as well did not get lawyers involved with some of this stuff as we got started, which opened the door for these types of lawsuits and things like that. So I'm saying that and I'm thinking about this, barriers to DEI, right? What would you say are some of the barriers that are out there right now that people aren't talking about?
Are you talking about in the corporate setting, the higher ed setting, just the work?
Either. I mean, I was thinking higher ed really, but either, because I mean, sometimes this stuff is symbiotic. What's happening in one place is going to move over there and vice versa, you know.
100%. But if we focused on the higher ed side, you know, I think that a couple of things for us to be thinking critically about. One, you know, I didn't really use, for example, this language around DEI as an acronym until a few years ago. I've been very specific in my language. I use social justice, education, and racial equity because those have theoretical bodies underneath them to advance the work. And so the thing that, and Paulette, you know, the president of NADA, he also encourages this. If we're using language, what does the language mean? And this is the way, for example, that the right's been able to co-opt CRT, for example.
Oh my God.
Critical race theory and its powerful work has been completely just gobbled by the right to basically mean whatever they want, just like they co-opted the word woke. They can say whatever they want. They can say grooming, woke, CRT in a sentence. It doesn't mean anything, but it means everything to the side that's listening to them.
Right.
Right. So I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying it's so misused. I hear it. It's yeah. Anyway. It's
so misused. So for us to be fierce about our language, to constantly be defining it and therefore defining the terrain, it has to be like a reclamation of the terrain from our end. What is our work? Who do we serve? How do we engage in that work? What supports the work, right? Whether it's theory or praxis. These are the things that we should be explicit about. So I'd say that's one thing. And that means not ceding ground. So, you know, for example, we see even in the higher ed space, because, you know, I read Chronicle of Higher Ed, I read Inside Higher Ed, and you see reporters giving in. So people are saying, oh, CRT, woke, and they're not being pushed on to say, what do you mean by that? Define it for me, define it for me, define it for me, right? And the challenge for, of course, those of us who work in the sector is to be able to define our work as well, right? So that we're better able to claim the terrain, which I think is critically important, at least the, you know, ideological terrain. So that's one thing I think folks sometimes don't get a chance to think enough about, but it has real import because they're using this language to attack our work, and we need to be just as assertive with ours. Other things that people need to be thinking about. Was that the question, Ralph? I just want to make sure.
No, I was asking. It could be what are things people should be thinking about. But I was talking about maybe some of the other unseen barriers that we're bumping up against in this anti-DEI fight that people aren't talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think this actually goes back to the core and the root of social justice education, which is that we are, if we're talking just about the United States of America, we are in an incredibly diverse country with people of a vast range of knowledges about their own experience and the experiences of others. And so one of the reasons the right wants to shut down our experiencing of the other is because you keep people in their own mind frame. And you keep them fighting against each other. You keep them fighting for increasingly scarce resources. That's why it is fundamentally a capitalist and a colonial tool, right? Then we're focused on fighting each other. We're not focused on actually destroying the metastructure that oppresses all of us in multiple ways, right?
Yeah.
But I'd say if we go back to the root and the core of like good social justice education is that introspection. Where's the opportunity for young people from, you know, ages 4 and up to think about who they are? What do they know? How do they come to know what they know? What do they think about other people, other groups? Right? We can ask those questions in gentle ways, right? Ways to bring up conversation when they're very young, right? What do you think about this or that? All the way through middle school, high school, college, and beyond. But the amount of calcification that people have around really interrogating, how did I come to know what I know? And what is it that I understand of the world around me? If we're not able to actually just even unpack that, we can't get to like, oh, well, we're going to now enact equity-minded change in this department. Because we haven't done that hard work. That hard work it has to be foundational, because otherwise we're not understanding how we're actually fitting into patterns of power, privilege, subordination, exclusion, and inclusion ourselves, right? So I'd say those are two, I know those are two big buckets that I gave you, but I think relatively foundational, language and meaning making, before we do anything else. That has to be there. And I'd say for all my fellow, equity and inclusion practitioners, make sure you're reading broadly and deeply, right? I just got the brand new 20th edition of Dr. Robin Kelly's book, Freedom Dreaming. Freedom Dream, sorry. And, I'm really excited to dig back into that again. I've got another book on my desk that I just got a couple months ago that I need to make time to read, called The Trauma of Caste. Written by a Dalit woman and scholar named Thenmozhi Soundararajan. For us to be reading deeply and broadly across sectors and across identity vectors only makes us stronger. Only makes us stronger because we're drawing from deeper wells, right? I still think, Ralph, about what I got to read as a women's studies student at Northwestern in the late 1990s, right? I read Gloria Anzaldúa and Cheri Moraga, and I read Bell Hooks, and I read Audre Lorde. I didn't just read memes, and I didn't get and I'm not dissing on memes, and I'm also not dissing on like the education you can get on TikTok. It's actually a valuable platform, which is why states are trying to ban it, right?
Yeah.
But I'll say that the education can't stop there. So if something whets your appetite, go to the source and read original sources and read Lorde and Hook and Adrienne Rich and right? Because to read their words again explodes our own minds and explodes our own capacity for doing this work, which is of course about ferocity, and it's about vigor, and it's about strategy, and it's so deeply about love. I don't mean that in a cheesy way. I mean, if you do not love your fellow human, then you will lose the thread in this work, because you will so easily fall into the pit of get me, forget mine.
Yeah. No, you got to read and be aware. I mean, I'm going back to Hollywood now, right?
Yeah.
This just popped into my head. I don't know if you ever watched the show. Gosh, I can't think of it. Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
And like a lot of shows, I watch them and I'm like, this couldn't happen, But I look at where we're going right now and how things have been like the past, maybe 7-8 years, we could be in a Handmaid's Tale. I mean, lifestyle here at this rate. So this, life imitates fiction kind of stuff is kind of scary to me in some regards. But to your point, people got to really stay in the books and keep reading. I do fear what's going to happen for kids coming up, what they are going to be able to be exposed to or not exposed to. Blue states, red states, are we getting ready to have a civil war over some of this stuff? So anyway, it's hard times. We're getting close to the end here. So
people in blue states shouldn't get comfortable. People in blue states should not get comfortable, because the chilling and silencing effects from all of this quote unquote red state legislation. And let's be clear, I'm sitting here in Cali. Cali passed Prop 209 back in 96, 97, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So we are not immune to, and there's no vaccination against the stupidity of racism and ongoing colonialism. So
yeah, I mean, you got to vote, right? That's the first step in some of this. But what advice? I guess last thing I want to ask you is, we were talking yesterday a lot about people being silent. In particular, people on campus, and we get it. People being silent for a lot of reasons, as it relates. I would say a lot of personal reasons. I think a lot of the sentiment was people are fearing for their jobs. Don't want to be on the wrong side of it. So silence is golden. But what advice would you give to those that are still in the field to help turn the tide, if anything?
Great question. I have been really particularly disappointed by the silence of university presidents across the country. ACE's silence, relative silence as an association, has been fundamentally disappointing. I have, colleagues over there, and I am just distraught at. I cannot imagine how it's okay that they're doing what they're doing. AAC&U has been putting out statements. NADI has been putting out statements, pushing on various levers. PEN America is doing great work. But for the National Association of Presidents and for presidents all across the country to be this silent and to be rolling over in the face of legislation and sort of pernicious activities by, local counter education bodies is stunning to me, right? Especially when you look at the salaries of some of those presidents, right?
Yeah.
And what we have here is we still have presidents who are out there. For example, Boston University, they had as their commencement speaker, the head of Warner Brothers Discovery, right? And thousands of students, staff, alumni had written to the college to say, don't have him as our speaker. The writer's strike is going on. Do not platform him. They gave him the platform. Students protested. That is their right. It's them exercising this part of their democratic principle on an important day. They turned their back on him. Some of them chanted. They said, pay the writers. And the president of that university puts out a public letter chastising the students, admonishing them, humiliating them, saying that they've embarrassed the college, the university, rather than the embarrassing choice that the university made, and saying that they have tried to enact the cancel culture, which, by the way, like the cancel culture, anyway. He's not canceled. He's your commencement speaker. He is a mega millionaire. And so this piece that their presidents making time to castigate their students rather than come out forcefully at this time like no other is really disappointing to me. So I'd say, one tool at our disposal is what kinds of relationships do we have with the boards of trustees on campuses? Because oftentimes there are presidents who will move at the behest of their boards, and depending on the kind of good work, for example, when I was the chief diversity officer, dean for diversity at Harvey Mudd College, I had a phenomenal opportunity to work with my board to help educate them, to lift them up, to help them think about themselves as inclusive and equitable practitioners, to help advance the college's mission as an equity-minded campus, right? I'm not saying I did everything right or that we got everything right. My point is in what way is your board of trustees equipped and activated to serve as a defense bulwark and to hopefully empower the president to do what's right in this kind of situation? And I know that the president doesn't operate alone. I'm not, naive about that. But the silence has just been loud. Yeah. Loud, Ralph, right? So that's one thing that I think that, anyone from quote unquote our side should be looking at is where the board's falling and how are they empowering the campus to set up additional litigation funds, bring on more general counsel, get ready with statements. How are they going to protect? This is the big thing to be asking the campuses, campus leadership is, once this decision comes down, how do you plan on protecting recruitment, enrollment, financial aid, targeted programs? What ways will we have to work around, over, under, behind, et cetera? Because that plan has to be, is now. It was yesterday, right? And so if it ain't happened, it better be happening now.
Right. Thank you. We couldn't end on a better note, if you will, but not that it was a good note, but no, thank you for your time.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.